a multi-stakeholder approach by bringing different perspectives, first from an industry analyst and a practitioner, and 2 from civil society, 3 from an investor, and then 4 from a government perspective. The importance of managing expectations, I think, is underpinned by several factors. First of all, the expectations are divergent, but very often, as I expect the speakers will illustrate, actually the expectations are sometimes unfounded, if illegitimate. But more importantly, the expectations tend to evolve and change over time. And both for investors, civil society, and governments, just keeping pace with the nature of expectations can be very challenging. But I think certainly from the African perspective, the African Development Bank perspective, expectations are challenging for us for several reasons. First of all, they can be a source of lack of stability, particularly if not met. They also can bring pressure to bear on both investors and governments to do and take actions that are essentially counterintuitive, if not counterproductive, in order to be able to respond. And so we think the importance of addressing expectations, if only to stabilize the environment in which natural resources are developed, is a very important consideration. So with those few words, I'm going to turn first to Keith and ask Keith, first of all, to give us factual context on what really are these discoveries. How significant are they? And therefore, to what extent are the expectations we see in the public domain aligned to reality? Shall I start with you, Keith?
Okay, do you want me to introduce myself first?
Yeah, yes. I think you should.
My name is Keith Myers. I'm actually a geologist. My background in education, I started off as an exploration geologist with BP. I was with BP for 13 years, and latterly I was BP's negotiator in Angola. So I tried to move from geology into commercial negotiations. And I left BP in about 2000, and I set up a Richmond Energy Partners, and we provide intelligence on global exploration and oil and gas companies. I also wear another hat because I was an associate fellow at Chatham House, and where we had a program called the Good Governance of the Natural Resource Sector, and through that got involved in governance, because in my career in the oil company I was involved in lots of African countries, and it always troubled me that the citizens of those countries where the company I was working for was exploring nothing ever seemed to get any better for the ordinary citizens. So why was that? What was the point of what we were doing if it wasn't benefiting the resource owners? So I've been on a bit of a journey, and I am on the advisory board of Natural Resource Governance Institute, and through that I've got involved in capacity building with parliaments. So I've worked in Ghana with the parliament in Ghana several times, about 4 times. I've worked in Sierra Leone and in Uganda, in Libya and in Iraq, and in at least 2 of the countries where I've worked in, they're now in full-scale civil war. So my impact as a governance advisor hasn't been terribly successful in those cases. But that's where my perspective comes from. So my comments are from that. If you could put the slide up.
Yes,
Who's in charge of the technology? What's the name of your presentation? That one. Okay, we'll put it in the slideshow. Okay, I just wanted to show a bit of context here. This graph here, this chart here, on the x-axis, we've got oil and gas production in terms of barrels of oil equivalent per person per year.
Number of barrels produced per person per year. And you'll notice it's a log scale. On the y-axis, we've got the oil and gas revenue as a percentage of government revenue. And then the bubbles are as GDP per capita. So the first thing I wanted to say is that within Africa, we've got to distinguish between oil-rich and oil-dependent. Nigeria is not oil-rich. Nigeria only produces about 8 barrels per person per year. But it relies on that for over 75% of government revenue. That is not a good position to be in, especially when the oil price cuts in half. Ghana is down here. Ghana is not an oil-rich country. It's got a very modest oil endowment. Even when the new fields come on, it will not be an oil-rich country. Uganda I plotted on here using the Oxford Policy Management modelling that they did for the Gates Foundation paper, because they haven't started producing yet, but the modelling suggests that Uganda also is it's not an oil-rich country, because when you divide by 33 million people, 200,000 barrels a day, it's not very many barrels. And Mozambique likewise, for all the huge volumes of gas, according to the Oxford Policy Management projections, Mozambique is in terms of the contribution to government revenue is fairly modest. Now up at the top, and I've coloured the African oil producers in green, and up at the top there we've got Algeria, Congo, Brazzaville, Angola, and Libya, and Gabon, historically the autocracies. So if you've got enough oil, and if you're producing enough oil and gas per capita, it's enough to maintain an autocracy virtually in perpetuity, it would seem. And certainly in the top right-hand side, you can see Brunei, Saudi, Oman, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar. There isn't really a democracy amongst that group. And then there's there's Norway down there. So Nigeria, in fact, is less oil-rich than the UK. So I just wanted to place that as a bit of context. I just wanted to. Have I got a couple more minutes?
Yes.
I just wanted to go on to a couple of other things. The democratic challenge, just some lessons from working with parliaments. This point that Sheila was making about managing expectations. I did 4 sessions with the Ghanaian Parliament, Ghanaian parliamentarians, and we went through the numbers on Jubilee. We did it all together, and we came up that it was about $30 per person per year in terms of revenue. This was a year before Jubilee started production. And I remember the parliamentarians saying, well, that's not very much. We thought we were going to, we thought it was going to be a lot more than that. That's nothing. We need to manage expectations. And there was a realization in the room that actually, but then something went wrong. And that's what I'd really love to hear from the Ghanaians in the room here. Is what happened? How did suddenly, you knew there wasn't going to be much revenue, but then suddenly there was a huge splurge in spending. There was a behaviour within the political class that you were oil rich, and there was a boundless bounty in the Tano Basin, which there isn't. So I'd love to hear what it is in the Ghana in the democratic process in Ghana. Which, for all the fantastic advice, all the best advice, all the technocratic advice, and all the initiatives that Ghana signed up to, they still managed to get it so badly wrong. I feel quite strongly about it because I invested so much of my time in trying to do capacity building. And finally, I just wanted to touch on, because I know our next speaker's from Nigeria, it was just the link, my other day job, which is valuing oil companies, is the extraordinary thing that just how it's all linked, foreign capital linked with actions of governments. So in Nigeria, the incumbent oil companies have been selling their assets. Shell have been selling their assets, and they've been selling them to indigenous companies. So these were tax-paying assets, and they're being bought by
what are termed indigenous companies, but they're actually listed in London. And then, for some reason, the Nigerian government has given tax-free status, what's called pioneer tax status, so these assets don't pay any tax for 5 years. So assets that were tax-paying are sold by Shell and then become non-tax-paying. I shake my head because I don't really understand the logic, but I'm sure that someone in Nigeria knows the logic of doing that. But these companies that are listed in London, 2/3 of their value is the tax-free status that they currently enjoy in Nigeria. So everything, the world is interlinked. The decisions that are made locally feed back into the capital markets back in Europe. So that's all I have to say.
Okay. It turns out from what Keith is saying that where we might assume lack of knowledge and capacity is the problem, that sometimes even when we have knowledge, there still needs to be much more that has to be done to get to the space where we want to. But I want to cut Zainab a little slack, because actually she is from Nigeria, but she came to speak with us with the voice of an NGO, not the voice of the nation state. So I think it's important that we know the capacity in which she's here. And I do wish to thank her particularly because you will notice from your pegs that Dr. Muzong was supposed to be here, and unfortunately he was caught and unable to come. So thank you very much for joining us. Please give us your own civil society experience, albeit drawing from the Nigerian experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sheila, for inviting me. And this is my civil society voice. Sometimes I talk for the government, sometimes for the companies. The EITI is a multi-stakeholder initiative. And I have been heading the EITI, which means I've been working with both governments, civil society, as well as companies. The fall in the price of oil has great impact on Nigeria. Several implications, such as exchange rate volatility, the Naira depreciates almost on a weekly basis, and sometimes it goes up a little bit, but mostly it's going south. And savings has stagnated for a very significant length of time, but especially now, it's even almost disappearing. Debt has spiked up, so our debt is on the increase. Every month, the government is actually borrowing to pay salaries. The total debt portfolio now, repayment obligations on a monthly basis, is more than what is earned as revenue from non-oil and gas. And capital expenditure is under significant amount of threat. There is no new projects that are ongoing, and a lot of existing projects have stagnated. And there's increasing amount of unemployment, which means industry is not thriving. A lot of industries are closing down. So for Nigeria, this is a time for us to make some very, very hard decisions. And it will be difficult to implement some of them, but still decisions that must be taken. Apart from the fact that the price of the commodity is declining, we are also, as a nation, on a daily basis, losing significant amount of crude oil through theft. And Mr. Keith said the marginal field operators that won these fields from existing oil companies operating in those areas, it's also another major leakage for us which needs to be plugged by government. So some of the decisions that we need to take will be that we must stop issuing tax waivers. There was an assessment that was made by budget that just in 5 months of last year, the government lost 25 billion naira in tax revenues that could have been accrued due to these tax holidays. And mostly the winners of this marginal fields are people that are friends of government in one way or the other. Even the Ministry of Finance was not happy with the tax waivers because it was done primarily by the Nigerian Investment Promotion Council and the Ministry of Trade and Commerce. Another hard decision we need to take is the need to pass very quickly the petroleum industry bill. Nigeria has lost investment up to about over 100 billion over the past couple of years. Investments that could have come into Nigeria are just hanging in space and maybe even lost by now because the petroleum industry bill is not passed. From a civil society perspective, several groups have made a lot of different kinds of efforts to push the passage of the PIB, but there is an industry that is very strong, as a matter of fact, stronger than government, that had interest in having this bill delayed, and it has been delayed to the extent that the 7th Assembly has passed, and now there's a new assembly that has to start the process all over again. There's also the matter of the discretionary awards of not just the marginal fields, but also some other fields that needs to be stopped. The president is allowed by law to award on a discretionary basis these assets that are supposed to be national assets. The beneficial owners are hardly ever known, so there's a need for us to face headlong the need for us to have an open register where beneficial owners of these assets are known, so that there's a chance that civil society can track how the revenues from these assets how the assets were acquired in the first place, and the process of the acquisition, and the persons that really own these assets. There's the need also to restructure a national oil company. The restructuring of the NNPC is not an easy task by any means, because NNPC is government itself, and there's so many different interests that want the status quo to remain, but it's a task that we must, as a nation, do. And the NNPC itself has been operating under a law, the NNPC Act of 1956, that actually allows it to sell crude oil for the country, and they are allowed to withhold their expenses before remitting to the Federation. And what that means is the NNPC actually has a blank check. It has a blank check to sell crude oil, withhold revenues from government under any category of expenditure, whether it is repair of pipelines or payment of salaries or training or catering, any kind of expenditure. It withdraws in the first place and it remits the balance to the Federation. As of 2012, the NAITI audit report indicated that NNPC holds up to about 46% of the crude oil sales revenue for its operations. And that's very, very significant. On a yearly basis, this cost is increasing. Now that in 2012, the oil price was very, very high. So what will happen now that the price has crashed? What is going to happen? Is NNPC going to cut its expenditure overnight? Or will it be that the Federation will not be getting revenue at all? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much once again. You have raised very important issues, especially the issue of beneficial ownership from a taxation perspective. I think, especially that the subject is governance, this whole notion of discretionary powers, I have to say it, I have terrible difficulty assuming that in an asset that is owned by an entire nation, one man can have the right to determine who will exploit it. It just seems to me, from a governance perspective, fundamentally flawed, given the custodial nature of governments. I think the role of national oil companies is really a very important one, and that's worth pondering. And I look forward to hearing from the audience your own thoughts. But I think you touch on an important factor. Many laws on the continent, first of all, vest natural resource asset in the state, but many of them also granted the state equity, very often carried interest. I often wonder what the logic of that is for, because ownership of any asset assumes that you will transfer that value in some form. And I think the point you make about what is the role of Nigeria's national oil company in this whole issue, and how do we hold them accountable and fundamentally avoid them becoming a state unto themselves, I think is a problem that plagues not just Nigeria, but many countries. But let me come to you, because you represent a national oil company, Statoil, in Norway, and now Statoil is an investor in its own right, exploring and taking ground in many countries of the world. So please, give us a perspective on these issues and challenges of petroleum projects in Africa.
Thank you, Sheila. I'm Egil Gloppen, representing Statoil, and my current role is related to the Tanzania gas project, gas and LNG project. First, a few comments on the low energy prices and how the international oil and gas companies tend to react in a situation like this. During the last 5 years, the oil companies have seen their profits eroded by the serious cost inflation. So it's not only the low prices that came all of a sudden, it's also a serious cost inflation in the upstream oil and gas sector, in particular for deep water and complex projects. Now, the sudden 50% fall in oil price to a prolonged new level, that creates investor uncertainty and also reduced appetite to take risk. Decisions tend to be delayed, and the typical reaction from oil companies would be to introduce more stringent capital discipline, to start cost-cutting programs, to introduce organizational efficiency programs, and to be streamlining their work processes. However, the oil companies in their evaluations of strategy and project portfolio are based on a long-term perspective. So when we look at portfolio and which projects to prioritize, we tend to look beyond the cycle. There is very long lead times in our projects, so what you decide today can have effect 10 or 15 years later, and we need to consider that. Statoil has a long track record of presence in Africa. We've been in Angola since 1991, and Angola is currently the single most important asset in our international portfolio. Also Nigeria. But I think the operatorship of the gas discoveries offshore Tanzania is a good case at hand, because it's a very capital-intensive project. It's a new nation which hasn't experienced oil and gas activities before, and they don't have the framework for it. They need to develop that framework. Some of the facts of the Tanzanian projects. The exploration period is now over, or at least for the present time. Significant resources have been proved by both the BG group and Statoil, the two groups working together. And these resources are sufficient to feed LNG project. And if we think in terms of the investment, a 3-train LNG development could mean $50 to $60 billion investment over a period, which is extraordinary for Tanzania. I don't think they have ever had an industrial investment like that. Corporations have been established among the project sponsors, and a joint project team has been formed to work the LNG plant. The IOCs have decided also to spend substantial amounts to define the technical robust conditions and solutions and competitive costs. But given the present state of readiness by the government to engage with the project sponsors, the pace of further technical work needs to be scaled appropriately. The timeline for delivering the project depends on achievement of some key milestones, such as access to the land where the LNG plant is going to be built, and also establishing sustainable terms. The potential of this project is immense in the Tanzanian context. It could mean a substantial contribution to GDP and government revenues, as well as a basis for industrial development through domestic gas supplies. In terms of the requirements that we as investors see, we would like to develop a partnership and cooperation with the host nation. We think this is fundamental, and to have an alignment of and joint ambition when it comes to project schedule. There need to be a joint understanding of the context and framework, and we also like to develop a project-specific legislation. Tanzania has just sent to Parliament a comprehensive petroleum law, which was heard in Parliament yesterday, I believe. We feel that the industry has not been consulted maybe appropriately in informing that, and we need to get proper engagement in that. The other thing which is important for the investors is to have stability of terms. We need to know that the terms we negotiate and establish now are durable for a long period of time. Then the government needs to establish supportive institutions and regulatory environment. And the IOCs naturally need to engage with the government to build capacity and assist with that. I think a viable investment project in this case will only happen when these fundamentals are right. Regarding the oil and gas price, it will only then be judged on the projections that are existing for the next 10-15 years. So I don't think that the present oil and gas environment necessarily influences on what we will see in the future. Thank you. That was a brief introduction.
Well, thank you very much for giving us that perspective. I'm intrigued by the expectation that there would be a project-specific piece of legislation, particularly in countries that are fairly incapacitated and can't manage existing legislation. But hopefully we talk about that when we open the conversation. One of the interesting things as I listen to you and thinking about the challenges and expectations is that, of course, when you say to an average Tanzanian, your gas project is significant enough that not only are we willing to invest, but we think the ballpark is in the order of 60 million. Do you know what they think? They say, gee, this is big. They are not looking at what you put up. So it seems to me that this public narrative really is very important to get right. Because you say that, of course, and the investors like to hear that. But what you are taking on unintentionally is the burden that you are scaling up beyond what you and I know comes out at the end of that. And I think this is quite challenging for policymakers, how to manage what is concrete information from an investor perspective and how that feeds into concretely what they will have to deliver. But and so I want to come to you, you lady representing the Kenyan National Oil Company, to give us a perspective. What do you see as the challenges in this space as your country now moves towards extracting oil?
Thank you. The situation for Kenya is that we are not a producing country, and yet we have one of the most vibrant economies in sub-Saharan Africa. For us, therefore, the concern of ensuring that whatever oil and gas resources have been discovered do not come to destroy the other sectors of economy that we have, but instead come to support, come to create new sectors, is actually very important. Natural resources from an extractive point of view are fairly new within Kenya, and yet we have very, very strong economic bases in services. We are a big service outsourcing center within the region. We are big in horticulture, we are big in tourism. So we have many other sectors of the economy that have been responsible for driving the vibrance locally. And so that concern to not then shift, that all of a sudden we will forget about all that just because there's oil and gas discoveries, is something that is quite important to us. Having said that, oil and gas, just by the nature of the big dollar signs that tend to float around when a discovery is mentioned, does lead to expectations that can be very difficult to manage across the board. For us, therefore, as a national oil company, when we engage at whatever level, including with the local communities, managing expectations of how lives will change overnight in an area just because there is a discovery of oil is something that is quite a major challenge in terms of just trying to keep the discussion focused on what is the reality, what are the lead times to production, what really can be the division of these resources between central government and local communities. You know, that can tend to be a challenging conversation when people start dividing, what they think should be their share of that particular resource. Therefore, the recent scenario when oil prices crashed, from my perspective, has been very welcome. Because you can talk to people about, having a boom-bust cycle. You can talk to people about the dangers of over-reliance on, a particular commodity when, prices can go the other way. But having people see the effect in countries that are dependent on oil and gas, and seeing the challenges they are going through when those prices crash, is a more powerful lesson than you could ever give in months of giving lectures. So that has been a very important experience in terms of just helping to manage the expectations on the reality of what can happen with this particular commodity. Our position as the national oil company in Kenya, we are quite clear. We are not a regulator. We do not want to be a regulator. We have not been a regulator. And we insist and emphasize to government on the need to have very clear separation and distinction between the different arms so that the policymaker at the ministry level is very clear. The regulator, whether a new regulator will be formed following the discoveries or whether the existing downstream regulator will have their mandate expanded to cover downstream, that should be clear. And then we as the national oil company are the holder of the commercial aspects as far as government is concerned within this particular sector. And having that separation is very, very important because like any other company operating within the sector, you do need to ensure you have a strong monitoring and oversight process that is equally applicable across the board to ensure that the companies are really doing what they're supposed to be doing for the benefit of the people of the country. We have been involved across the supply chain as NOC. Before the discovery of oil, we have a strong downstream presence. And again, as the commercial entity of government, we don't get money from government, we give money to government because as a commercial company, at the end of the day, you have what you agree with government at the beginning is what are your targets? And at the end of the day, you come back to see have you delivered against those targets. But at the same time, because you are a national oil company, we offer strategic engagement in terms of, for example, going into areas that other companies whose mandate is purely commercial may not be interested in going into, all for the benefit of the people. Finally, what I would want to say is really there are very many different experiences between countries and between companies and national oil companies in terms of those who have done a good job or haven't. And the distinction between the good, the bad, the ugly, and everybody else in between is just what governance structures have you put in place. And so what we are seeking to do at the very early stage of our own story as far as oil and gas is concerned is really learn from everybody, not only those who've done a good job, but also those who haven't. Where did they slip? Where did they fall? What can we learn from them in a bid to see how we can help put some structures in place for the benefit of Kenya?
Well, thank you very much. I think the point you make about Kenya avoiding the resource curse, bringing in natural resource revenue, and with that dampening the enthusiasm of other sectors is a very important one. And I think you do well as a government to recognize that and put measures in place to avoid destroying what is essentially a fairly robust economy by African standards. And destroyed at the expense of what is really just a geological windfall, because your deposits are in themselves not substantial. So we wish you luck. I think also the importance of recognizing that one of the inherent messages in the decline now in the prices of petroleum is to remind those who are at the beginning that actually there is a level of risk, and then the role of national oil companies and the relationship. If you can get that right and get that your national oil company is treated equally by the state as your foreign investors, you will have achieved what very few countries do. And so once again, we wish you luck. Well, now we've come to the end of the presentations here. I'm going to now open up for comments and questions. Please let me remind you that this is a live feed. What you say here will be captured. And so be honest, restrained, unrestrained, but polite, courteous, and stick to the facts. But more importantly, please be brief and come to the point. So I'm going to take the first 3 questions, and then I'll let the panelists respond. And then we'll take it from there. So I'll start with the gentleman here, and then the one in front, and then the lady over there. So we have a lady over there, we have 2 gentlemen next to each other, and then we will take. Please introduce yourself and fire away.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Satya Yuda from Indonesia. I'm Deputy Chairman of the Energy and Commission and also the Environment. So my question directly to Mr. Egil Magne from Statoil, is that correct? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, looking at your type of contract, is there any link to the profitability? So means that if there is any changing on the oil price, you still got benefit on it. You don't need to renegotiate with the governments and basically adapt it to whatever oil price will be. Is that correct, or you have a different type of contract? Thank you.
Shall we take, yes, please? Yes, please.
Thank you for a great panel. My name is Odd Fjelstad. I'm from the Michelsen Institute in Norway and also a professor at the University of Pretoria. Yeah, it was a great panel, and I liked very much Summaya's comment that maybe this was a great thing which happened with the drop in oil prices. This gives an opportunity for the government really to focus its policy that Kenya and Tanzania and many other countries which have now found petroleum and gas will not live only on or sustain their economy on the those resources. They have to diversify their economies, and Kenya is in a very good position already. So it's important to maintain what you already have achieved in other sectors. I have one question to Egil, Magne from Statoil, and that is, you mentioned that you are operating in a number of African countries, Angola, now Tanzania, and also other countries. But when it comes to contracts, do you have a similar contract with Sonangol in Angola as the one you have in Tanzania? And if not, why so? Finally, the graph you have on the PowerPoint here, on the screen behind us, is very illuminating. And Keith, he really pointed out that this was very useful as an eye-opener for policymakers. But do you also, I think it also could be very useful to add some figures on, for instance, revenues per capita. Norway has a very diversified revenue structure. We have a non-oil tax system which is working very well, in contrast to Angola, for instance. So revenue per capita and oil and petroleum revenues per capita would also be useful, and also petroleum barrels per capita, because the countries here like Norway, Qatar, Brunei are very small or thinly populated countries. So it is expected that they have high per capita barrels. So I think this graph here is it could be expanded and be used even more effective for this communicating, managing expectations for policymakers. Thank you.
Okay, so the lady.
Hi, my name is Adrian Klasa. I'm an editor at the Financial Times' This is Africa magazine. I just wanted to ask a question about a point that Zainab brought up, where she mentioned that there was an estimated $100 billion in lost revenue due to the fact that the PIB bill in Nigeria has been sitting in government for about 8 years now. And I was wondering where that estimate came from, where those numbers came from, and perhaps why, I guess just where the numbers came from and whether that seems a realistic number to those who are also in the private sector, sort of looking at this. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So let's start with Statoil. You have two questions, one comment, and then we'll come to Keith, and then we'll go to Zainab.
Yeah, can everybody hear this?
I think your mic is on.
Okay. Regarding the contracts, it was a question of whether the contracts in Tanzania need to be negotiated with lower oil prices, if I understood it right. The contracts that Tanzania negotiated back around 2000 was production sharing contracts, which is a common concept that oil and gas companies are familiar with. And of course there are peculiarities from country to country, but the pattern is that of production sharing, and so the oil and gas price will obviously influence economics, but there is no expectation either from companies or from the government that these have to be renegotiated. And the other question was from...
But is it an R factor, or is it profit related, like in Angola? That's
no, it's pure volume-based production sharing in Tanzania. And that is a difference, to, as you say, in Angola. But the general arrangement is that the production sharing.
Your contract is not really linked to the profitability, but you're linked to the certain oil price when you sign the contract.
No, not really. It's a production sharing, because the oil price will influence how soon you recover your costs, but and will also govern profitability, but it's not linked to a special level of oil price.
Yeah, it's different from an Indonesian though. I mean, it's not. It's volume related, the split.
Yeah.
Whereas Angola, it's rate of return related, so it caps the company share as the return on capital increases. So, and then you get a certain amount of downside protection. That's why the Angolan contracts, very sophisticated contracts, and they've been I don't think they've ever been renegotiated. They seem to suit both sides. Very sophisticated contracts.
Kate, you're on.
Oh, right, okay. On the graph.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for your suggestion. There are already 3 parameters, 3 dimensions, so I'm not sure I can do 4 dimensions, but yeah, I mean, your point about Norway is well, the fact that for all, absolutely, the countries at this end have a characteristic, they produce a lot of oil, or they have a very small population. That's the per capita point. Norway, compared to its these contemporaries, though, has been the most successful in diversifying its tax base for all the oil wealth that it's had. Of course, Norway sits over here, but some of the countries it's advising sit way down there. So, obviously the Norwegian model has to be. There are a lot of lessons, not least for the UK, because we share the same petroleum basin, but. It has to be, the Norwegian model obviously has to be adapted for African countries that are less well endowed with oil.
Excuse me, may I? I think that your question is important, but I think more important is how governments might use this slide, which is to say it's important to know the relative size of your population to your resource endowment, and therefore the capacity of that resource to deliver to those expectations. And I think this is why it is important. And so the factor of population actually is a driver of that capacity. And it is government's ability to understand that even when they are major producers, sometimes, such as in the Nigerian case, because of the population quantum, actually they are not resource rich. And that is what is so important, because if we look at it only in terms of what they produce, not the capacity of that to impact, then we miss the point. By the same token, you could find relatively small producers with small population, but they could be rich because their capacity to distribute income and to impact human development would be that much greater. And so I think just understanding that dynamic rather than loading it with more data and using it subject to your own demography, I think is a more important factor. But let me come to you, please. Tell us where you get this figure. You are in trouble now.
Well, actually, it's a research work, a policy document that was produced by Budget, and it's called Falling Oil Prices, an Opportunity for Reforms. If you visit the Budget website, you'll find it.
I guess I was more curious, though, than to sort of see from those in the private sector on the panel, whether 100 billion loss seemed like a realistic estimate.
The OPT is the Organized Private Trade Sector, which is actually an association of the IOCs in Nigeria, also have their figures of what is locked in investments that could come into the country because the passage of the PIB is still work in progress.
But I'm intrigued by this notion that there may be different laws for different people, because I think there should be a law for an asset in a country. But I have terrible difficulty understanding how a state can say, we have this law for this set of shareholders and this other law for this set of shareholders. It just doesn't seem right, because when you think about it, the Nigerian government's primary responsibility is to sweat the oil asset, not to advocate one or the other in the interest of one set of shareholders versus another. So I think, to me, there is a fundamental, first of all, moral question that relates to being a custodian in the first instance. But also there's a fundamental development question which relates to the economics of sweating a national asset and seemingly just giving windfall for reasons that don't seem to be defensible. But that was just my view. So we come to you now. You had a question, Sir? And then we have a lady there, and then we have actually, I'm looking for another lady. I had 2 men last time, so I'm balancing this gender thing. A lady with a question, I have 1. Another lady with a question? No lady. Pity, I'm failing, so we'll come to you, sir. So 1, yeah, there's a gentleman here. Lady there, and then gentleman.
I'm Mark Beer from the Oxford Policy Management. I've been doing a lot of work in Tanzania, and you make a very valid point about the size of that investment. At 60 billion, which is more than what we were looking at a 2-train, that's approximately double the GDP of the country. So as you say, it's a significant investment. However, that also creates a huge obligation for you, and I'd like you to perhaps comment on that. How are you going, and your partners in the TLNG, that's the Tanzania LNG Consortium, how are you going to leverage a maximum amount of that to actually build local businesses, build local suppliers, strengthen those linkages back into the economy? Taking account of the fact that Norway itself achieved exactly that by articulating its needs through an article, and I think it was Article 48, but I think it escapes me right now, where you actually made it an obligation on investors to use Norwegian services and Norwegian companies. So in that context of your own history, I'd like you to perhaps comment on or perhaps answer my question.
You must remember, of course, that he's not the government of Norway. He's Statoil for now. But still, you have to answer the question. Please, madam.
Hi, my name's Chantal Jordison, and I work with the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary in Canada through the Extractive Resource Governance program there. First, just a small observation about the chart here. I thought it was interesting to see that Canada wasn't up there, just a first comment, but my question is unrelated. This session is kind of about stakeholder perspectives on the low oil price, and it seems to me that in part due to the constraints around production sharing agreements, but other reasons as well, that the low oil price disproportionately has a negative effect on certain stakeholders rather than others. Particularly, companies can kind of scale back their activities or change their expenditures according to the price, but governments have less flexibility. I'm just wondering if the panel could discuss a little bit about who benefits the most from these low oil prices. My estimate would be that governments probably don't benefit the most.
Please.
Thank you so much. It's Nicholas Garrett. I'm a director of RCS Global. And sort of transparency
can you bear with
specialist.
us, please?
Sure.
Let's see if we can silence that. You're going to get punished. You have to buy all of us a drink after this.
Technology. So your wake-up call.
It's a wake-up call.
It is. It's from the US. It's probably 10 of the power, perhaps. Oh. Okay. Please.
Excellent. Thank you for that interlude. Okay, great. So a quick question, considering we have Zainab on the panel, which I want to make use of. So in the context of falling oil prices, obviously profits at the production stage are decreasing, whereas on the trading side of things, obviously traders are not dependent on a base price, but on a price differential. So typically, a lot of trading companies are actually having a wonderful time at the moment in terms of profitability. So this brings me to the theme of beneficial ownership, which has been sort of mentioned again and again in the various sessions throughout the morning and again in this session as well. There is a pilot under the EITI on beneficial ownership disclosure under the EITI, of which Nigeria is also taking part in that. Quite often, trading activities are undertaken through fairly complex constructs of different companies where the beneficial ownership is not always obvious. So my question was for Zainab, really, In this context, would you be able to update us on the progress of the pilot in Nigeria and also the effectiveness thereof? Because answers to that question may also help us shine some more light on the bigger question of whether corruption prevails or decreases in the context of decreasing base prices. Thanks so much.
Okay. So again, we start with you, Statoil, on the question of whether or not you're going to apply the same rules of engagement in Tanzania with respect to using your capacity to springboard that economy the way we did it in Norway.
I think that the local content is obviously an important issue everywhere. We invest. I think the big difference, if you look back to Norway when activity started during the early 70s, is that the country had an industrial base to build on. There was shipbuilding, there was fisheries, there were a lot of marine-related activities that could easily adapt to the new oil and gas industry. This is obviously a challenge in Tanzania, which has a very low industrial base, but you need to start somewhere, and we are in discussions with the government now how to shape the local content regulations. But this will take time. We have to be realistic. Other countries like Nigeria have a very high targets for local content, but it depends. Of course, you need to be patient, I think, and you need to work with government to develop gradually.
Let me just share perspective. We just did a very quick assessment of petroleum and mineral legislation on the 54 member states of the African Development Bank. And we found out that 50 of them, all in some form or other, in those legislation, reference the need for local content. So what am I saying? That actually it's potentially a value proposition. If you take that gentleman's cue and use this, actually your stakeholders in Africa expect it. Now, whether it's legitimate or whether they have the industrial base to pull it off is another matter. But that they expect it is an absolute certainty. So I would say, rather than worry about the capacity, take the lead and say, okay, you want to do it? This is what we think you should do. This is what we will do with you. Because the expectations, not only on you, by them as your regulator, is huge. The expectations on them by their citizens is even bigger. And that pressure is going to come to you. And you take a proactive approach and engage that, the pressure will be a little less on you. So Zainab, you are next.
Thank you very much. Nigeria opted to be one of the pilot countries for the beneficial ownership project that was initiated by the EITI. And what we were able to do in Haiti, having come to the reality that it was going to be difficult for us to actually get the real owners, was we asked the companies, first of all, to give us the information, and most of what we got were companies that are registered in Nigeria. So we went to the corporate registry and got names of the directors. But we knew that these are not the beneficial owners of these companies. In Nigeria, as a public official, there is a law that makes it criminal for you to hold this kind of investment. So what happens? The publicly exposed persons still hold these investments. Then they put the names of their drivers or their sons or their daughters or their wives. So we know, it's common knowledge, we know who owns an asset, but you will not find any document that says this is the owner of the asset. So for us, that's where we've come to now, and we're hoping that when we provide the information up to the level of the corporate registry, that a civil society group should be able to take up from there and do more research in that regard. We had, during the course of the pilot, been exposed to some ownership of some companies in Nigeria that went to up to about 7 stages around the world before you can actually get down to the owner. The EITI is not resourced to be able to cope with that. So it must be other civil society that have the capacity that will take up from where we are able to stop and do more investigations. And it's very vital for us to continue to talk in country about the need to expose this ownership, because a lot of the issues of improper governance, preferential allocations, tax waivers is all centered around the real beneficial owners of these assets.
Thank you, Keith. Who benefits from this?
Okay, I'll answer that one. Plus, there was a question about Canada. Why is Canada not on the chart? It's IMF data on. It's because I didn't have the data on percentage of government revenue from oil and gas for Canada. That's the only reason. But obviously, a very resource-rich country. So, who benefits from low oil prices? Well, the volatility benefits traders. Traders love volatility, so they continue to make money, and actually, when oil prices are volatile, make a lot more money. So they're immune really to rises or falls in oil prices. In the UK, who benefits most? Companies, oil companies, or governments? Well, it depends how you can take different perspectives on this. In the UK, for example, many producing oil fields, are not generating any profits. So there's no taxable profits to tax. So the companies aren't making a profit, and the government is not getting any tax. And there's a large number of fields in the North Sea that are in that situation. It depends on the sophistication of the contract. Some contracts, which are rate of return based profit sharing, as oil prices go down, it may be that the oil company's entitlement goes up, both in terms of cost recovery, its cost oil, and its share of profit oil. So in production sharing arrangements, it may well be that the company entitlements are going up. That doesn't mean to say they're making more money, or much money, but in terms of their entitlement barrels will probably go up. But it's not an easy question to answer.
Did you want to add to that,
Yes.
Maya?
I think in the context of economies such as ours, who benefits when oil prices are lower, we have seen the Mwananchi, as we call them, this is the common citizen benefiting. And during the time that oil prices did go down before they started swinging up again, we did see about 15% increase in oil consumption at the retail level in terms of increased, private transport on the road, where even people who had parked their cars and not used them for a long time would retrieve them, and actually you could see that in the traffic jam increase as well. There was a significant, about 15% increase in consumption. That did not necessarily translate to the industries and manufacturing entities, because a number of them decided to take the benefit of the price drop on themselves rather than then pass it on to the consumers. But the lobbies groups then did start the campaign of, why is it only the transport sector lowering prices? Why are the industries not doing the same? And some industries then started leading in terms of price reduction and therefore giving that benefit to the consumers. As far as upstream is concerned, we did see reduction in terms of activity. So companies became very choosy in terms of where their capital would be invested. Those that already had found discoveries did pull back, because a number of them, their programs were too far advanced and the discoveries had been made. So they concentrated on consolidation, areas where discoveries were already made. Could they do more? Could they appraise? Could they intensify exploration programs there? But in terms of new exploratory work, we have seen companies decide to be a lot more choosy in terms of what to do. Midstream, however, I think the reduction in prices has led to benefits for traders, but also a potential enhancement in refining margins. And so in terms of what we hear, about midstream infrastructure projects being planned and coming on board, very large-scale storage projects being planned, projects to do with breaking bulk and, perhaps new oil jetties. There has been quite some sustained discussion and interest on midstream projects, and we may see perhaps a number of those coming on board, including in East Africa.
We have about 15 minutes left, so I'll take the last round of comments and questions, and then we'll probably wrap up. So we have a gentleman here. We also have another here. We have two here.
Hi there, my name's Tom Mills. I work for Adam Smith International. I've been based in the Ministry of Mines and Petroleum in Afghanistan for the last 2 years and work more generally in the region. I realise humour me because that's not Africa. But my core question and the risk we really face in Afghanistan has been a theme throughout these presentations that we've had today, has been around expectation management. And I just wanted to understand a bit more what you thought, where the responsibility lied to mitigate and manage that key risk. Who is the responsible party for trying to manage these expectations? And what do you think, and how is the best way for these organizations to do it? I know we have a big problem in Afghanistan, whereas the citizenry believes it's sitting on gold bars, and that will never be met. So I'm just intrigued to know what you think about who and how.
Okay. Please.
Thank you. My name is Holger Grundl. I'm with the UK Department for International Development. I'm wondering what the panel thinks, whether the panel thinks during times of low oil prices, whether national governments should be more discerning when it comes to choosing the investors, particularly for large projects. Maybe when Keith is doing valuations of companies, should he add a dimension of quality of corporate governance and the kind of the quality of the regulatory regime that companies are subject to? And then maybe Sheila could go and advise governments whether they should accept some of those investors, or whether maybe it's a better option to leave some of the stuff on the ground until the situation improves, or a better offer comes along. Thank you.
Any other question? Okay, so we'll deal with those two. I'm going to try and add my penny's worth to the subject of expectations. I'm okay. Thank you. I mean, I guess one way, and it's not a science, it's a perspective. I guess one way of thinking about that question is, where lies the greatest risk? In other words, if we fail to manage expectations, who suffers the most? And if you think about it in the context of natural resources, there's two entities up front. First, it is the investors, and then it is the governments, who are the government of the day, who stand between the expectation and the delivery. And I think in the bigger order, then it is the industry. If this failure is elevated, if you wish, to global magnitude, then you get an industry that essentially has a bad name. And when an industry has a bad name, then it cannot attract finance into projects, and it cannot drive consumption, because then you destroy investor confidence and consumer confidence. And if you understand that, then it says to you that the people with the vested interest in the health of that particular sector are the ones that must drive the maintenance of these expectations and make sure that they are not so disproportionate they begin to drive a negative sentiment, which then essentially obliterates the industry. I think this is one way of looking at it. But if we look at it at a micro level, say you have a project, in my mind, it is the people that are investing, and then it is the government that is licensing. And both have a different role to play. In your space, it's nice to say we have made a discovery. This is the magnitude of what we will pump, because you drive stock. And that is what you trade. This is dangerous, because the people from whom, or the country in which you extract, really cannot relate to this. If you say it's good, then it's good. Then they're going to get money. You want to rethink this narrative. There's a disconnect between the language of investors and the language of the population. And this has to be narrowed somehow. The politicians, on the other hand, they say we have discovered oil. Actually, no politician that I know ever discovered oil. It's discovered by Petroleum and other exploration entities. They go and they cut the ribbon and they have their photograph. Of course, my grandma sitting in Africa thinks, we have oil, well, my problems are over. But of course, we know they are not. So I think basically that the responsibility is not singular. I think the responsibility sits in both camps. And part of how they manage that is that they've got to be careful about the narrative. They are really pushing themselves against the wall. They are raising expectations. They are making utterances that do not resemble reality. And until and unless we reverse this, we are perpetually going to find ourselves in a position where the petroleum sector seems to deliver a lot more than it is capable of. But I'll give the panelists an opportunity to say something, and then I'll come to you later.
My experience with this is in many the countries that I've worked in, the issue is finding a messenger that the population trusts. Because there's a low level, in many of these countries, there's a very, very low trust in government, that it's acting in the wider population's interests. And there's a very low level of trust in international business. So finding trusted messengers is key. And that might lie in civil society, might even be church, it may be whatever the population, whatever the in that particular context is trusted. It also helps if everybody sings from the same hymn sheet. And the politicians and the elders in society have a huge responsibility to communicate through their networks. So I don't think it's necessarily the business of oil companies. I think actually they're fairly low down the food chain when it comes to this, because they clearly have a vested, they will perceive to have a vested interest. So it's finding trusted messengers in my view.
Well, not just about managing expectations, but about who benefits. Oftentimes, governments, especially in Africa, do not clearly portray some of the positive things that has happened. The falling price of oil also has some positive implications. In April of this year, for the first time in the history of Nigeria, since oil was discovered, non-oil revenue was greater than oil revenue. It increased from the month of January by 61%, and that's very, very significant. And the civil society should pick that up and run with it to say that there's actually a potential for other sectors to grow. Government has been talking about alternatives to oil and gas, but now all of us know that we have to turn to other sources of revenues other than oil and gas. So there are some positive things, even to the falling price of oil.
Thank you. Anybody else wish to?
Yeah, let me
go ahead.
I think the issue of managing expectations cuts across the board, and every one of the parties involved in the process has their own role as far as managing of expectations is concerned. At the end of the day, there are expectations that need to be managed at the leadership level to ensure that they are then making decisions that are informed on the basis of the reality of the discoveries, and not perhaps being over-optimistic on what this resource is and how much can come, therefore, to influence the budget, for example. But I think moving down the chain, managing expectations at the local level is really about your social license. And if you don't have that social license, sometimes it almost doesn't matter that you have an official license from government. You simply will not be able to carry out the works that you need to carry out amongst the communities if you haven't managed their expectations and brought them on board. Being able, therefore, at the oil company level to engage with the local communities as well as the government doing the same is absolutely critical. And I think at the heart of this is really addressing information asymmetries, because if you go into the ground knowing things that people don't know, and of course that will always be the case because you're the technical expert, you really need to be able to package that message in a simple way that people can understand. What are you there to do? How long will you be? What will it cost you? If you don't do that, you will get that one person who has a little bit of information because they went to your website and read a statement you issued as a certain, press release, and interpret it however they think they should interpret it. And by the time your equipment is going onto the ground, the entire community is against you because of the interpretation they have made on something that you said somewhere. So your ability to break down the information in a manner that communicates to the different stakeholders that you're dealing with is absolutely critical to really help you manage those expectations.
Okay, so Helga, you asked me a question on whether the bank might ever advise governments to not go the extraction route because perhaps the perceived benefits don't justify. The short answer is no, because in many ways, it is not really, the decision to extract is not often made by governments. It is driven by the investor, because the investor will make a discovery. And many countries license exploration in the understanding that people are sinking money and that the only way to recoup would be through development and sale. So in many ways, by the time we come in terms of investments, that contract is already in place, and the legitimate expectation on the part of the investor to be able to extract has already been created. But having said that, if we just speak in terms of policy option, of course the option not to extract is always there. And it is always there not just for the reasons you state, which is that the trouble we get may be worth a lot less, may be a lot less justifiable. There are other reasons, because every time you extract, really you are making a trade-off decisions. First of all, trade-off decision, which is you have a piece of land, which is an asset. You could use it for agriculture, or you could, quote-unquote, sterilize it and use it for extraction in the assumption that the economic value of extraction exceeds that of agriculture or other resources. And so we encourage governments always to understand and make this trade-off, to look at their natural resources, if you wish, as a portfolio of assets and say, given our own development needs, to what use should we put these assets singularly and collectively? We think this is not only an economic, but it's also a sustainable development debate, which is important. But we also think in terms of the green economy, that it is very important. Some activities lend themselves to the green economy more than others. The extractive sit, if you wish, on the extreme end, while we are looking for solutions. And there are other much more greener economic interfaces between the economy and natural resources that may well be the reason why you don't extract, even much less than whether or not the economic value and the impact on human development is justifiable. So that is the level at which the African Development Bank engages governments, is helping them know it is not self-evident that extraction is the solution from an environmental, social impact, and economic impact perspective. We have 2 minutes, so I'm going to say we call it a day.
Can I add to that?
Yes.
Because this decision to extract is a bit of a misnomer, because it's a decision to explore is the key decision, because when you license an area for exploration, part of the condition of the license for the licensee, if they're going to invest dollars, is that they'll have the right to develop anything that they find. So it's not for the concept that Tanzania would say, turn around to Statoil and to Exxon and say, actually, we've decided, I know you spent $1 billion drilling all these wells offshore, but we've actually decided we'll just keep it in the ground. You can see where that's going to end up. So it's really about a decision to explore. And related to this managing expectations, my experience is that governments do They leave it to companies. They issue the licenses to explore. They make a decision to explore, but the local communities don't even know the licenses have been issued. And then suddenly the oil company shows up with their seismic crews, and the onus is left. It's the oil company. You need to explain to the local communities. I think that's wrong. The government needs to be going to the local communities and explaining that it's doing this licensing process, and explain the whole thing before the exploration starts. I think often governments negate their responsibilities.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. We will. Where shall we go for that drink then, Patrick? You owe us a drink. Somewhere green. Okay, then. Thank you very much, and I appreciate your interventions.